Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today for the Electrification Coalition's Rural Communities and EVs webinar. I'm Ann Blair, Senior EV Policy Manager at the Electrification Coalition. We are a nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization committed to promoting policies and actions that facilitate the deployment of electric vehicles on a mass scale in order to combat economic, environmental, and national security dangers caused by our dependence on oil in the transportation sector. To that end, we are deeply engaged at the federal, state, and local levels to encourage EV policy adoption and programs that transition more of our vehicles to electric. Over the past year, we've seen significant transition in the growth of the electric vehicle industry, as well as the policies that will have a profound impact to ensure that all communities are able to take advantage of the benefits of electrification. The bipartisan infrastructure law signed last month by President Biden will help us make substantial progress in the development of EV charging infrastructure and supporting electric school buses for all our nation's kids to have a cleaner ride to school. The Build Back Better Act, which is still pending in Congress, would take us even farther by supporting consumers, businesses, and manufacturers. Our federal agencies will be instrumental in helping to lead this transition, including the Department of Transportation, the Department of Energy, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Department of Agriculture, among others, and the support of our congressional leaders. Joining us first this afternoon, I'm pleased to introduce Sam Wojcicki. He's the Legislative Director with Representative Spanberger's office. Representative Spanberger represents the 7th District of Virginia. She serves on the U.S. House Committee on Agriculture and the U.S. Committee on Foreign Affairs. So we're very glad to have you, Sam, speaking on behalf of Representative Spanberger. So please take it away.
Thank you, Ann, and thank you to the Electrification Coalition for having me today to talk to the work my boss is doing in Congress to advance transportation electrification in rural areas. This is a really important conversation. I'm really excited that you all are focusing on this. Travel by people who live in rural areas constitutes actually like 68% of our nation's land miles, but residents in rural areas only represent about 19% of our nation's population. So this is a huge issue when we have a mismatch between the infrastructure we need and the amount that folks are driving. Over the next few decades, a community's access to electric vehicle charging infrastructure could be just as crucial to their economic outlook as access to high-speed broadband internet is today, something we know rural communities have challenges with, and something my boss hears a lot about on the House Agriculture Committee. I grew up in a rural community, and as anyone who did knows, rural communities have far too often been the last to receive the benefits of new technologies. This could be clean drinking water infrastructure, house electrification, or, as I mentioned, access to high-speed internet. Thankfully, Congress is taking steps to already address this and get ahead of this issue. And as Ann mentioned, the historic and bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act made targeted investments in electric vehicle charging infrastructure across the country and put a particular emphasis on rural deployment, recognizing the challenge and the great opportunity for the climate that rural transportation electrification can have. But there is reason to be concerned that this alone will not be enough to avoid EV charging deserts across rural areas. This is a down payment, but it's not as far as we need to go. And so that's why one thing I wanted to highlight for you all is the work that my boss is doing through the Electric Charging Infrastructure for Farmers Act. This legislation would leverage USDA as a partner, a trusted partner of rural communities and of farmers through the USDA's existing Rural Energy for America program, or REAP, to include electric vehicle supply equipment as an eligible expense for farmers and agribusinesses that apply for this support. For those who don't know, REAP is a program that provides financial assistance to agricultural producers and rural business owners to install renewable energy systems and adopt energy efficiency measures, as well as put energy storage in place. And while right now it can, at some targeted, limited capacity, support electric vehicles, charging equipment, that has not been its primary use. And so my boss really heard from farmers in her district across Central Virginia about how this is a real interest. And I know folks think this is a long way off, but for our rural communities, we're seeing how Ford and GM and Rivian and all of these companies are kind of leading the way towards electrifying their fleets. And, they want to have access to those technologies. A lot of our farmers use pickup trucks in their daily operations, whole fleets of them. And, to access and service parts of fencing across cattle farms in different areas across their fields. So being able to access, electric vehicles there cuts down fuel costs for our farmers. It also provides a new charging infrastructure for the community that they serve and the community that they live in. In the last 6 years, REAP has been really successful. It's leveraged over $300 million in public investment to stimulate more than 10 times that amount in private investment, and delivered $4 billion in energy efficiency and renewable energy projects for rural America. This is a program that needs to be tapped, and it can be tapped in the transportation context as well. The change that this bill outlines will help ensure that farmers, agribusinesses, and by extensions, our rural communities have access to EV charging. And it will leverage existing relationships within the USDA's Office of Rural Development, which has been doing projects like these going all the way back to the 1930s. I want to just highlight that this bill, we're really proud of the wide range of stakeholders that we've gotten support from. That includes major car companies like Ford. It also includes environmental groups like the Natural Resources Defense Council, the Environmental Working Group, Earth Justice, and groups focused on this issue in particular, like the Zero Emissions Transportation Association. But what's really critical about this bill is that it's bipartisan. And we worked with Tom Rice from South Carolina, a Republican, and we've seen a wide range of interest across members in both chambers about this bill and about what it would bring to the table. So just like rural broadband, we think we can unite a lot of folks behind something here by focusing on rural America, and actually in doing so, cut a lot of GHG emissions and really expand the reach of EVs and reduce our greenhouse gas footprint. I do want to highlight that what Ann said is true. This alone is not enough. The Build Back Better Act, we were really proud, included additional funds for the REAP program, including a bill that my boss led with Senator Tina Smith and Rep. David Valdeo in the House, another bipartisan bill called the REAP Improvement Act, which would significantly expand this oversubscribed program to make sure that this program can be tapped for as many uses as possible and really build on its success that it's already had. So I'm really excited for the conversation today. I think this is a fantastic program. I want to say thank you again to Ann and the Electrification Coalition for having me be here as a part of this today and having our office represented. And anyone who's interested in the Electric Charging Infrastructure for Farmers Act, I would encourage you all to reach out. Our door is always open. So thank you again, and turn it back to Ann.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam, for joining us and for the leadership of Representative Spanberger. We're excited about those initiatives and eager to help the success of those. All right, so now I'm going to shift gears to Katherine Stankin. She is our Senior Director of EV Policy here at the Electrification Coalition. She leads and manages our policy team. Prior to the EC, she was Policy Director at Plug in America. And prior to that, she was Director of Government Affairs at the Solar Energy Industries Association. Katherine, welcome.
Great, thanks, Ann. And yeah, super excited to be here today to talk about two favorite topics of mine: electric vehicles, for anyone who knows me, and then also rural communities. So I know we're going to pull up the slides here, and I will advance to the next one here. So Ann has already run through who we are as the Electrification Coalition. So we'll dive right into our topic, which is that the EC is today releasing our rural guidebook. And so we started our journey with our rural guidebook here by interviewing a series of folks to understand how we can better be equipping rural communities to get ready and take advantage of the EV moment that we are in right now. And so our guidebook does three things. First of all, it establishes a record of facts around EVs for rural communities, because we found that there's still some misinformation lingering around out there. And then it highlights the current opportunities for rural communities in terms of some funding opportunities and economic development opportunities. And then finally, we highlight 5 concrete actions that rural communities can take today. So I'm going to breeze through just a couple of the myths that we're addressing in the guidebook, talk about those opportunities really briefly, and then get into the call to action that we have too. So first up, the first thing that we heard by doing our series of interviews with folks was that EVs are expensive. And this is definitely not true anymore. There's lots to correct with this. So first of all, there's the rapidly declining cost of batteries in economies of scale, showing that the upfront price of electric vehicles will be at parity with gas vehicles in less than 2 years. So most forecasters are saying around 2024. And on the medium heavy duty side, certainly there are some that are achieving parity now. And for the majority of medium heavy duty classes, we'll see that around 2027. But if you add in some of the financial purchase incentives that are out there right now, whether it's at the federal level, the state level, and even some at the local level, EVs come out on top. Plus, if we look at the savings on fuel, which there is a picture of the Department of Energy's e-gallon calculator there that shows for Nebraska what we're looking at, that shows how the cost of electricity is much cheaper than the cost of gasoline. And so that shows the equivalency, what it would be to fill your car with gas versus with electricity. And then finally, if we look at the savings on maintenance, this is where for rural communities, you really start to see significant savings because of the distance that rural drivers are typically driving, and also because their reliance on private vehicles more so than other options such as public transit or walking or biking. And so with the savings on maintenance, you can see there the total cost of ownership is far less for an electric vehicle than for a gas vehicle. And the BEV on the left side, that stands for battery electric vehicle. And you can see the declining costs there. The second myth that we wanted to bust today and talk about is that there are no EVs that work in rural communities. And while that may have been the case a decade ago, that's certainly not the case today. There's been significant investment from manufacturers across the board into battery technologies and into their makes and models, resulting in more than 40 EVs on the market today, with about 90 plus available in the next couple of years. And the chart there shows the pickup trucks that are available to drivers today. And I'm very excited about that because I live in a rural community. I live 100 miles outside Phoenix, and I see pickup trucks on the road all the time. And this is because they're a necessity for the way of life out here. We need to be able to adapt to the right road terrain, meet the working conditions, and just the utility that's needed with those vehicles is why we're so excited for electric pickup trucks to be available today. So moving on to one more myth that we wanted to talk about right now is that charging stations are complicated and require upgrades to the electric grid. And so this is certainly not a one-size-fits-all answer. And we just wanted to highlight the fact that EV charging can be as simple as a 120-volt outlet, which is something that you would plug your computer into or you'd plug your toaster into. That's certainly not the case as you get higher into charging levels, but really what's required first is that rural communities do some planning and look at how how they drive, how far they drive, and that then will help to determine where you need charging stations, how many you might need, and at what power level, which then all dictate the any upgrade that might be needed. So moving now to talk about some of the opportunities. So we just very broadly, the current funding opportunities, and Sam mentioned also the bipartisan infrastructure law. And so these are some of the new funding opportunities. And I won't talk too further into them because Rob is going to address them in his presentation next. And then when we think about economic development opportunities, there's three categories that we looked at in our guidebook. One is the job opportunities that are available. We're seeing, as I mentioned, significant investment from the automakers, and that means new manufacturing plants in a lot of rural communities, battery recycling plants, and there's also jobs associated with the installation of the charging stations themselves. Secondly, we've got investment going back into the community from EV charging. And so in the guidebook, we talk a little bit about destination charging and tourism. And one community that is doing this very well is Boulder City in Nevada. They're located in between the Hoover Dam and Las Vegas. And so they are strategically placing some charging stations around the community to draw folks in and encourage them to spend longer time in the downtown area. And anecdotal evidence suggests that EV drivers, when they're stopping to charge for more than 20 minutes, they'll spend between $5 and $40 on amenities in the area. Also, the savings that drivers themselves will have and fleet operators too from going electric will be invested back into the community. And that can range from anywhere from $3,000 to $7,000. So, that's money back in the pockets of drivers in these communities, going out to the businesses in these communities too. And finally, then the economic development opportunity with leapfrogging over other alternative fueled technologies and saving money. And so I'd like to just highlight the electric tractor that is now and ready. That's a select track tractor there that we're seeing a big turnover in the agricultural tractor industry by going to electric. So now moving into the call to action. And so 5 things that we encourage all rural communities to do right now. And admittedly, it will take a little upfront time and effort from communities, but the long-term dividends and payouts are significant. And so first of all is having a plan and a strategy in place to really capture this EV moment now. And so that really does look at or need to be how the drivers are charging, where, what's going to be needed, et cetera. And also looking at what policies might be needed. Secondly, engaging with your local utility to discuss the planning for the adoption of EVs. Local utilities can be great partners as you're planning for where the charging stations need to go. And they're great advisors. Third, leading by example and electrifying the public municipal fleet. The EC has a number of tools that can help with this. We have our Drive tool, which is a free tool available to anyone in rural communities to look at your fleet. You just put in the makes and model, and then it will show when it'll be possible to turn that over from gas to electric and the savings from that too. Fourth, be a part of the conversation happening at a lot of state legislatures in terms of funding for the highway transportation system. We hear about this quite a bit, and while we agree that all vehicles should be paying their fair share for the roads, but certainly nothing punitive for electric vehicles that would be above and beyond what current gas drivers are paying. And so we are just highly encouraging that communities come to the table and find solutions for this so that we can reap the benefits of going electric. And fifth, then identifying and engaging with additional public and private partners. And so the joint office that's set up now between the Department of Energy and the Department of Transportation is a great way to engage with folks. You can reach out to the Electrification Coalition or our EC Business Council members. We all stand ready to help communities capture this EV moment. So I will turn it back to you, Anne, and we'll proceed.
Great. Thank you so much, Katherine. So our next speaker today, I'm very pleased to introduce to share one of US DOT's most recent tools that'll help our communities realize the vision of electrification that cuts our oil dependence, reduces emissions, and builds a new, cleaner transportation future. Rob Hyman is the Transportation Policy Analyst in the Office of the Undersecretary of Transportation Policy at USDOT, where he researches the impacts of climate change on our transportation systems. Robert was previously an environmental protection specialist at Federal Highway Sustainable Transportation and Resilience Team. He holds a master's degree in civil and environmental engineering and technology and policy from MIT and a bachelor's degree in earth and planetary sciences from Harvard University. Welcome, Robert. We're so glad to have you and learn more about this toolkit.
Thank you so much. So I want to talk to you today about a toolkit we just released yesterday. It's called Charging Forward, a toolkit for planning and funding rural electric mobility infrastructure. And here's the slide. And what this is a free resource to help rural stakeholders scope, plan, and fund EV charging infrastructure. Next slide, please. Before I dive into the toolkit itself, I want to tell you just a little bit more about the Roots Initiative, which is the part of DOT that developed this toolkit. The Roots it stands for the Rural Opportunities to Use Transportation for Economic Success Initiative. It's a very long acronym, really one of the best acronyms we've had at DOT. Roots was established at DOT specifically to address rural issues and to make sure that rural considerations are incorporated into all of DOT's planning and programs. We have 3 main areas of activity. We work to engage rural communities through events, even such as this, to make sure we understand the needs and priorities of rural communities and to get data from them, and to help identify solutions that are helpful to rural stakeholders. We're working to harmonize DOT programs to make sure that, as I mentioned, that rural policy is incorporated throughout the department. One of our big efforts is going to be reestablishing the Roots Council, which is an intermodal effort across the department to coordinate rural programs throughout the DOT. And the utilizing whole of government approach is really about us recognizing that DOT is but one of the rural-focused federal agencies within the U.S. government. And then, in fact, other agencies such as USDA have a much greater on-the-ground presence in rural America. And we really want to be able to take advantage of that presence to promote our resources to their customers and to make sure we can really capitalize on synergies between these funding programs. Next slide. So back to the toolkit. The primary idea behind developing this toolkit is the idea that we want all Americans to be able to benefit from the lower operating costs, reduced maintenance needs, and the improved performance that electric vehicles can provide. So why rural? Katherine alluded to a lot of this already. For rural drivers, transportation is actually a higher percentage of expenses than it is for urban drivers, 20% versus 16%. They spend considerably more on transportation fuel than urban households, 44% more. They drive farther every day, an average of 10 miles more per day. And then why now? Now is the time when we have this bipartisan infrastructure law that gives $7.5 billion of funding for new EV chargers and other alternative alternative fueling infrastructure. We have a strategy to build 500,000 EV chargers nationwide. We have an executive order targeting the number of vehicles sold to get more zero-emission vehicles out there. So the idea behind this was really to make sure that this toolkit can consolidate all this guidance, all these federal opportunities to help rural entities plan and fund EV chargers. Next slide, please. So this toolkit is really meant to be a one-stop shop to help rural stakeholders in their planning for charging infrastructure. It highlights the benefits of EVs for rural areas in terms of cost savings, economic development, future-proofing. It helps identify key stakeholders and partners. It walks through a project planning checklist, provides technical advice, compiles helpful tools and resources, and most importantly, it goes through a complete list of all the federal funding and financing programs that have some eligibility for rural projects and for EV charging infrastructure. Next slide, please. This just gives you a sense of what the toolkit's going to look like. As you can see from the table of contents, we kind of walk through the basics of EVs, the benefits that EVs can bring to rural areas, these partnership opportunities, kind of a complete guide to how you go about planning EV infrastructure in rural areas, and then this focus on funding and financing. We don't just do grants, we also talk about loan opportunities. We have success stories in there. This is available on our website as both a printable PDF and an HTML version that's more browsable. We recognize that in rural areas, broadband access can be limited, and we wanted to make sure that if people need to have something that they can print out and look at offline, that they can do so. Next slide, please. In terms of the audience, any rural entity can use this toolkit. It's meant to sort of span the whole suite of rural stakeholders from state governments, departments of transportation, departments of energy, local and municipal communities, tribal governments, transportation providers of various kinds, and nonprofit organizations, also businesses and individuals. We wanted to make sure that if there are, say, restaurants or attractions that are thinking about installing EV charging infrastructure, they can also use this toolkit and understand how they can go about the whole process. Next slide, please. Now, I do need to explain something a little bit about the toolkit, which is that this is theoretically a beta version of the toolkit. It's fully polished, but what we mean by that is when we put out this toolkit, we wanted to give it almost a test drive first and get feedback from our stakeholders on what works and what does not work in the toolkit and what other information is needed. So we plan to, over the course of the remainder of the winter and the spring, we are planning up to 10 workshops with individual rural communities to essentially pilot the toolkit, get community knowledge on EV infrastructure, get their feedback on this toolkit, what works and what doesn't work. In the summer, we're going to release a revised version. This will give us an opportunity both to incorporate the stakeholder feedback, incorporate information on a whole suite of other programs that we did not have a chance to get to in the original toolkit, including dealing with electric transit vehicles, school buses, micromobility. And then, of course, most importantly, it allows us to fully incorporate the programs that are in the bipartisan infrastructure law. We did not incorporate them into this first iteration of the toolkit because many of these programs are still being set up. And so although we briefly mentioned them, we couldn't really cover them in any great detail. For instance, Federal Highway is coming out with guidance for one of its big funding programs at the end of next week. So we wanted to make sure that we could get the toolkit out, people could start using it, and then we're going to have a second crack at it. And over the summer, we're going to get out a revised version that incorporates all this new information and will hopefully be an even better product. Next slide, please. So to talk about what's in the toolkit, it covers, as we mentioned, kind of a wide range of issues. It talks about the benefits to individuals and communities, similar to the kinds of things that Katherine mentioned, both for individuals about lower ownership costs, convenience of being able to fuel at home, the sort of ever expanding array of vehicle options that are more appropriate for rural areas that are now coming out, increased resilience. There's opportunities with some of these EVs with bi-directional chargers to actually use your electric pickup truck as a backup power source in place of diesel generators during extreme weather events. And then for rural communities, there's lots of economic development opportunities, both for attractions, for improving public health from reduced emissions, and then of course lower greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. We recognize as well the various challenges and evolving solutions that are out there for EVs, and these are discussed in the toolkit as well. We recognize the higher initial costs can scare people off. More importantly, in rural areas, people get really concerned about range anxiety. And so we discuss that and how does that actually play out given that EVs are coming out with longer and longer ranges, so it's becoming less of an issue. And in fact, that if you look at even most rural drivers, the average distance that a rural driver will cover during the day is almost always well within the range of an EV, and it's really for those longer trips where people start to get concerned. We talk about the potential need for grid upgrades for things like DC fast charging, and an understanding that in rural areas the infrastructure may not be as prevalent for what you need for these kinds of chargers. But then, of course, there's also low awareness. Rural communities have typically had less exposure to EV technology than urban communities. And so if you're if you're putting out EV charging infrastructure, you have to be aware of that. And you may be navigating unfamiliar permitting, unfamiliar siting processes when you're implementing these projects. Next slide, please. Partnership opportunities. We go through the kinds of partners that you may want to team up with in order to get EV charging infrastructure into your rural area. This includes, statewide and tribal partners. It could be DOTs, state DOEs, or environmental agencies. You can have local and regional planning partners like Clean Cities coalitions, other transportation planning agencies. Electric utilities are obviously extremely important, providing that technical advice on connecting to the electric grid. And sometimes they're willing to take ownership of aspects of these installations. Charging networks, such as private charging companies, obviously are can own and operate and maintain charging infrastructures. And then site hosts are obviously important in terms of understanding where these are going to go in, and they can be very attractive to local businesses. Next slide, please. Another thing we provide in this toolkit is a project planning checklist. It helps to take the guesswork out of planning to help folks know what they need to consider in this process. The idea behind this toolkit was very much for folks who have an interest in installing EV charging infrastructure, but simply may not have a whole lot of experience. And we wanted to make sure that we could kind of walk you through the whole process. Next slide, please. A big issue as well is, of course, is equity considerations. And so we have a section in the toolkit on that, covering some of the things you may want to consider in planning EV charging infrastructure, the community engagement, public involvement that you may want to think about. And we cover some of the tools and data sources that you may want to use to help inform a more equitable project. And you can see some of those maps and tools listed over on the website, on the right side of the slide there as well. Next slide, please. Overall, we tried to provide links and descriptions of as many tools as we could. And this is, again, in keeping with the idea of a one-stop shop. We wanted to make sure that you could look at this one document and it could help you figure out what you needed to use without you having to wade through the websites of 10 different agencies or try to figure out what's important to you and what's not. So we have a compilation of planning tools, including these equity-related resources. We have calculators, both online and Excel-based, links to interactive maps, links to other reference documents as well. Next slide, please. In some ways, the core of the document is this EV infrastructure funding matrix. And this is a table and a description of funding opportunities organized by agency with information on the eligibility of applicants, funding amounts, and the types of projects eligible for funding. It's pretty long. This spans 11 pages in the toolkit. We have it also available as a filterable list online for folks who want to go through it in a more interactive way. Next slide. One of the key things about this toolkit is it does not cover just US DOT funding and financing sources. We made a concerted effort to look across the federal government. We have a whole section on USDA funding and financing sources, Department of Energy as well, EPA. We wanted to make sure, again, one-stop shop, that you could come to this one place and figure out where you could go, where you could find money and what you could do. Next slide, please. This gives you a sense of some of the kind of key federal programs that we highlight in the toolkit. Within the Department of Transportation, we have programs of Federal Highways, CMAQ, Federal Lands Access Program. FTA has its Bus and Bus Facilities Program. Within the Office of the Secretary, we have the RAISE program, which is a $1 billion grant program. It's even more this year. Department of Agriculture had the Rural Development section of USDA has numerous programs that can apply to this. Community Facilities Grant Program is one of the key ones, but we list, I think, literally a dozen other programs at USDA. And then, of course, programs at DOE, EPA, we discussed the IRS tax credits. And then we briefly mentioned, as I said, these programs that are in the bipartisan infrastructure law, but these will be discussed in much greater detail in the next iteration of the toolkit. Next slide. That brings us to the end of this presentation. Here are the links to both the Roots website and the Toolkit website. You'll notice we have a link for feedback there as well. Of course, you can find this on the website. We are very interested in getting your feedback on what you think of the toolkit, what is useful, what you think we could do better. As I said, we have a second shot of this in just a few months, so we really want to make sure we make this toolkit as good as we possibly can. The email there, feel free to send us emails on anything you like. We check that email all the time. There's multiple folks looking at that inbox. And I'll also note that on our website, we have an EV landing page as well, which right now links primarily to this toolkit, but as more guidance comes out and more programs come online, we're going to be adding more and more information to that. So folks will, even before the next version of the toolkit comes out, folks will have a place to look for rural relevant EV information. Thank you very much. And back to you, Ann.
Great. Thank you so much, Rob. What an awesome resource to have available. And, I'd just like to note, we're really enthusiastic that DOT launched this toolkit in alignment at the same time, as our guidance. We think these are really good complements with the guidebook, which we will share with everyone via email following the later this week. And then also I've put the link to the toolkit in the chat. Of course, Rob included that in the presentations, which will be made available to all participants today. But really a great complement. One focused on, messaging and specific action steps, another focused on, all the details to help communities really deploy this. So we're going to transition right now to a few questions for you, Rob. And in addition to a few resource questions that folks had asked in the chat. So first is, there's a question about assistance. Are there any grant writers available that can help support rural communities apply for some of the grants that are profiled in the toolkit?
So that's something that really varies by agency. At DOT, unfortunately, we have not done so much. We don't do so much in terms of literally helping folks with their grants. USDA actually takes a much more hands-on approach. And with their grants and financing programs, you can really work very closely with them to actually help fill out the application itself. Obviously, there are also consultants as well who are very versed in federal programs and can help folks out with filling out these applications. And as I said, for the newest programs, the guidance will be coming out soon on those.
Great, thank you. Another question, what are some of the biggest challenges that, in the course of developing this toolkit that rural communities have shared in regard to their challenges in deploying charging infrastructure?
One of the biggest challenges we see with rural communities always is actually the ability to both have the resources to apply for these grant programs, because some of them can be complicated, and it can sometimes be hard to, if you have a small government, small municipality or just a county government, it can be hard for them to find the time and effort to put together grant applications. But the other thing we've found is often they have issues with money in the sense that many federal programs, DOT in particular, require a 20% match. And that can be difficult. It'd be difficult to get that money together. And that's a problem we recognize. It's hard for us to do much about it. I will say that some of the new programs that are coming online actually allow a smaller match for rural areas. And so I think that's going to be a great opportunity. But it can be an issue.
Great, thank you for that. And another, similar question, can you speak to the role of public and private partnerships in supporting rural communities and access to some of the grant funding?
Sure. So I think with EV charging in particular, there's like a huge potential there. I think both in the sense that you have opportunities to site charging infrastructure at private businesses, and that's really beneficial to everyone, both to the business and to the community development, and also, frankly, makes sense for the drivers. I think there's also lots of opportunities in that many of these charging networks are private companies. And so they can provide an enormous amount of assistance in siting the chargers, running them, operating them. I think they have varying business models, and even, one company will have different ways of running the chargers. So you can really work with them to install charging. And then lastly, I think the electric utility companies also provide an incredibly powerful partner in EV charging infrastructure. We've had some great conversations with rural electric co-ops. Many of them are really interested in this topic, really looking for ways to promote EV charging. You see them doing things like, they're looking at getting EV trucks for themselves, EV pickup trucks for their own fleet to start to demonstrate to their customers that these are viable. We had great conversations with a co-op in Minnesota who told us all about how they have a site where they operate EVs and kind of in one of the very cold parts of Minnesota, specifically to demonstrate that winter is not a problem for these. So I think there's tremendous opportunities there.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Well, we're going to transition now to a panel to answer some of the other questions that have come into the chat, as well as we do invite you, please do continue to put questions in the chat. So our additional speakers on the panel today, in addition to Katherine and Rob, we have Matt Nelson. He's the Director of Government Affairs at Electrify America. He previously served as Chief of Staff in the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. He also served as U.S. Senator Dianne Feinstein's Senior Policy Advisor for Energy, Transportation, and Climate Change. He holds a Master's of Arts in Law and Diplomacy and International Business Relations from the Fletcher School at Tufts, and a bachelor's degree in history and environmental studies from Dartmouth. We're also pleased to have Michael Wurtzel, sustainability coordinator in Summit County, Colorado. He is a sustainability coordinator for Summit County government, where he creates and manages projects, initiatives, and efforts to implement the county's climate action plan. He holds a master's degree in environmental science from the University of Tennessee in Chattanooga, and bachelor's degree in environmental policy from Sewanee, the University of the South. So welcome to both of you. I'm very glad to have you all here with us today. All right, so to get us started, I'm going to ask some of the questions that have come in through the chat. So first, for you, Matt, how has Electrify America taken equity concerns into consideration in rural communities?
Well, Electrify America is the largest public charging station, public network of DC fast charging stations in the U.S. We've got 800 stations open and built today with more than 3,500 chargers. And we focus, when we decide where to build these stations, we use a number of criteria. One of which is, so we think about like where they're needed, where there is demand for a station, where the utility rates allow them to be operated in an economically sustainable manner. But one of our other core criteria is our corporate social responsibility pillars, and equity is one of our core pillars in that evaluation process. So as a result of that approach, we've been able to build stations that are disproportionately or substantially in rural areas. We on a per capita basis, we build many more stations in rural areas than urban areas, and we also build a high percentage. In fact, more than half of all stations we've built are in disadvantaged and low-income communities. It's allowed us to build infrastructure by focusing on ultra-fast DC fast charging. We're able to build stations in communities of all types, a real diversity of communities. It's important to realize that we aren't alone in this. The DC fast charging industry is investing in communities that a lot of folks think are underserved. California just came out with a study in last year, in the middle of 2021, that showed that DC fast charging stations are built at, there are 11 chargers per 100,000 people in low-income communities, 14 chargers per 100,000 people in moderate-income communities, and only 9 chargers per 100,000 people in high-income communities. So there's actually more investment in our sector going into the low and moderate income communities than there are in high income. So bottom line, from our business's perspective, equity is a core consideration when we cite projects. Luckily, it appears we are not the only ones that do that. And as a result of that, there is significant investment in what are traditionally viewed as underserved communities in the DC fast charging industry. I'm emphasizing DC fast charging. This is not true in the level 2 business at all. It's a completely different industry with different players and different siting decisions. But Congress has just put, has been referred to a few times today, they've just invested $7.5 billion into charging. And Congress was pretty clear that they said they want it to be highway-oriented stations that are focused on charging speed, which means ultra-fast charging. And by doing that, Congress has pretty clearly said that they want this investment to be focused in rural America. And so that's a very good sign. It's a very significant investment. If the states follow Congress's direction, we'll have a very substantial increase in service for DC fast charging across rural America. It can be done. We've already kind of laid the groundwork for this. We've invested in 46 states. 55% of all the stations we've built are highway corridor stations. So it can be done, and Congress has really given a boost to that effort.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. Very helpful. I'm going to shift to you now, Michael. Similarly, I know in Summit County, you all have deployed some electric buses. What are some things that you all have addressed regarding equity, as well as some additional challenges in a rural area, such as, high altitude or colder climates? Could you address some of those issues and how you all have handled them?
Yeah, sure. So a rule of thumb with electrification is that the more a vehicle drives, the better it is to electrify in terms of cost savings for diesel and in terms of the impact on greenhouse gas emissions. So we were lucky to be supported with some federal programs for our Summit Stage transit facility, the no-low bus grants. And we started out with 3 zero emissions buses for our Summit stage fleet. And a little secret here, they're not really zero emissions because they do have diesel heat pumps that provide heating and AC. And what our partners over in the town of Breckenridge found that when you have an all-electric bus operating at very, very cold temperatures, like it was -20 this morning in Frisco, is that you drain that battery a lot more quickly with the onboard heating and cooling. So we stuck with diesel for that, but it's electric for the rest of the transportation. The other thing we're really excited about is we're designing an all-electric bus barn, basically. So that would accommodate our 26 buses today and up to 30 in the future. So we realize that we're going to have to do a pretty big investment in our bus fleet to get there in terms of having one day an all-electric bus fleet. But we're adding about 1 electric bus a year. We started with 3 out of 26. We'll get another one this year. We'll get another 1 or 2 next year. And so we're really excited to start there. And then the other thing, there's also local incentives. So the state of Colorado has the Charge Ahead Colorado grant program for electric vehicle charging. And we've been able to take advantage of that to add some charging to be an electric vehicle friendly workplace. In addition, the other thing, we're really lucky to have Xcel Energy as our electricity provider in Summit County. They've rolled out a program where they actually, I know Rob mentioned that, they will install the infrastructure. So the transformer, the cabinet, the EV meter, which will be on EV specific rates, and they will do all that. And then the county takes it from the chargers. So that saves us a ton of money and allows the utility to kind of chip in. So I know a lot of rural providers have small utilities, perhaps a co-op or something. If they're not on board with the electric vehicle charging, have your county manager or your town manager or your elected officials call them, because electric charging is probably the best business opportunity they've had since Thomas Edison invented the light bulb.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael, for sharing some of those experiences. So a question, and this will be open to anyone who would like to answer it. This came in on the chat saying, we've had free EV charging for over 10 years with 5 chargers at our business. As we're getting more heavy usage, we want to begin charging for a charge. So they're looking for what are some good ways to convert current charging stations to allow for billing users. Is there anyone that wants to take that?
I'm happy to take that. So if a business has been offering free charging for 10 years, it's probably level 2 charging. It's probably relatively slow. And you can, of course, add payment to that in a number of different ways. You can charge by the minute. You can use a number of apps to add that, or you can literally add a credit card reader to existing hardware. We are focused on the DC fast charging business. What we find is that if you want to bring in service, if you want to bring in customers, the DC fast charging model is now much more successful in doing that, because unless your business has customers coming in for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 hours, the charging that they get on a DC fast charger is a much better alignment with what a typical customer does at a retail establishment. If you want to upgrade from public charge from your existing network to a DC fast charging network, you have 2 options. The first is you can buy the hardware, and it would be a full replacement, and you would need to upgrade, and you need to probably get new service from a utility. Or the second is that you partner with an owner operator of DC fast charging stations. That's what we are. That's what a number of other companies in our industry are, and we become your tenant. So we rent some space in your parking lot, and we operate, own, procure, manage the relationship with the utility, pay the utility bill. All you have to do is get a very low, usually approaching $0 per month rental fee to give us a license to that site. But that's what we have found that most site hosts, especially individual business owners, prefer. It allows you to avoid being in the charging business yourself. It allows you to focus on your core business, but still have all the benefits of bringing in customers through the presence of a charging station. So that's in a nutshell the two options you've got, and a lot of small businesses prefer the tenant partnership with a DC fast charging provider due to its simplicity.
I'm going to add to that question too, just about how you could take some free charging and then make it a service that it's paid for. There's a nonprofit group out there called Adopt a Charger that they it's a way that certain entities can then sponsor that station too. So whether it could be a very private donor that just wants to see their community utilize the station more, or it could be a group of businesses that pool together. And so that can then sponsor that station there and the charging, the electricity needed there. So I'd encourage you to check out adoptacharger.org.
Great.
And say hi to Kitty when you do.
Great, thank you. So a couple other questions that have come in. One is, what is the expected support and federal funding to advance and enhance domestic mining for critical mineral and rare earth minerals? Can anyone speak to that today? I know we don't have a specific focus on that for this particular event.
Well, I'm happy to jump in for that. I mean, there was some funding that was looking to be put towards the critical minerals, mining and recycling. So there are some programs out there, and I believe that would fall more under the Department of Energy. And so EC's sister organization, SAFE, is really involved in that. We have our Critical Minerals Center that's pretty heavily focused on that. And just a note about mining too, we have a report coming out probably in about 6 weeks that's going to look at building out the supply chain here in the United States and building out the critical minerals here so that we can be meeting all the demand for electric vehicles going forward.
Great, thanks for sharing that. So next question, what additional steps are being taken to incentivize utilities to add capacity to the grid to support electrification and improve reliability? Matt, is that something that you are familiar with?
I could step in too, but Rob, do you want anything to?
No, it's not my area of expertise.
Well, so in the community grants, so with the $2.5 billion that are out there for the competitive grants from the bipartisan infrastructure law, there's a section for the community grants, and there is funding that will be, or you can take advantage of that funding and use it for the pre-development phase there to be looking at what's the planning needed, what's the build out needed, the extra capacity, if at all. So you can put some of that funding towards that. And so that is helping utilities to be able to do this.
I can also jump in there and talk about my experience with Xcel Energy a little bit. So once again, call your electricity provider and see if there are any incentives that they offer for EV charging. Xcel Energy across Colorado, starting with the Front Range and then up to the rural mountain communities, is installing smart charging or smart meters in all of our buildings. So once those smart meters are installed, we'll have the opportunity to subscribe to time of day use rates. So basically, Xcel has a ton of extra energy on the grid overnight, and the charging rate that will be offered to Summit County will be something like 50 cents per gallon of gasoline, approximate equivalent there, to charge our fleet vehicles overnight. So they're really incentivizing adopters of EVs to charge when electricity is abundant and has a lower cost.
Great. Thanks so much for jumping in there, Michael. And a follow-up question for you and also for Matt. What other recommendations do you have for rural communities as they do this? You've highlighted a lot of them, but what are some things, other things that rural communities can consider for their deployment?
Well, I can just jump in and start off taking this one. I think one of the things I've found with rural communities is you really have to meet people where they are with vehicles. And one of the things I've noticed being the sustainability coordinator and coming from an environmental background is a lot of times we don't talk about how electric vehicles are simply better and just superior to internal combustion engine ones in almost every way possible about the vehicle itself. And that's why they're storming the vehicle market at the moment, because car manufacturers know that the internal combustion engine is going the way of the horse and buggy. So, I like to talk to, when I'm talking to our facilities and fleet guys, talk about how these vehicles are actually better and how, they're coming, and we need to start putting in the infrastructure now to adopt them when they're available. And a lot of people like to get into like the nitty gritty of the specs, and they're pretty amazed when they start to learn about like how fast these cars are, how powerful they are. Especially, we're doing a infrastructure project with our police department, and we found that our police vehicles drive way more than our standard fleet vehicles. So, we found that our sheriff's office, they're interested in this, lower fuel costs, increased speed, higher performance. They're idling a lot, so the battery actually becomes something, that's really attractive to them. So, and then the second thing that I think about is just start small. Here at Summit County, we just decided we want to be an EV-friendly workplace. We want our employees to be able to charge, and we want our visitors to be able to charge. So we're just deploying, some level 2 charging across the county at our facilities, and that's where we're starting. And then we're moving in to an electric vehicle replacement policy and kind of a charging policy or a charging plan for the whole county. But you can start small. I like to tell people there is EV charging everywhere. In places that aren't very cold, an outlet might be all the vehicle needs for, its daily charging. So start small and meet people where they are.
Great. Thank you so much. So we're going to take just two more questions. So there was a follow-up with something you mentioned, Matt, about your network. And so I want to ask, kind of a larger question on, can you talk a little bit about the ownership of different networks and the different models that you're seeing out there, and how you might expect that to evolve with additional public funding?
Sure. So Electrify America builds ultra-fast charging stations. We focus on 350 kilowatt charging that can provide 20 miles of range per minute. We believe that is the right public charging network for rural America. There were some questions in the comments about kind of where these stations are built and where they are in relation to rural America. We think that's a critical question. So first, you can do ultra fast charging in rural America. There's a perception that you can't, and that is 100% wrong. It's easier to build ultra fast charging from a grid perspective in rural America than urban America. What we do is, first and foremost, you partner with the utility, the local utility, in the feasibility study of a site. In every community in America, there is a place you can build an ultra-fast charger. It's just a matter of working with the utility to make sure it's cost effective. For example, a single Walmart parking lot can be $500,000 difference depending on which corner you choose. So work with your utility and you can bring down those costs, and it's feasible to do it in rural America. Second, build at existing community service centers. Build at your shopping centers and at your grocery stores. That's the way to build in a way that serves the communities in which you are constructing. Everybody goes to the grocery store. Everybody goes to the shopping centers in their community, and you can build those while still servicing the highway corridor. So the federal government just put $7.5 billion in highway corridors. Don't build along the highway. Don't build in the highway corridor. Build along it, just off the exit at your local grocery store. That's the way to service both the community and the traveler, and use the federal dollars effectively. And third, invest in charging speed. In rural America, the vehicles coming to market are bigger, they have larger batteries, they will take longer to charge unless we build faster charging. If we build the generation behind, if we build 50 kilowatt charging or even 100 kilowatt charging, it won't meet the needs of rural America. If we build 350 kilowatt charging, if we're adding 20 miles of range per minute, you can add 200 miles of range in only 10 minutes. That's a reasonable stop for somebody that drives longer distances. And in rural America, distances are longer and people drive further. So those are our three thoughts. Make sure you work with the utilities, build in the community at commercial, and make sure to invest in ultra-fast technology.
Thanks for sharing that perspective, Matt. Appreciate that. So just final comments from you, Rob. Wondering if you could share more on ways that the folks interested in EV charging in rural communities can work with you and others in DOT most effectively as these charging plans roll out.
So the first thing is I realized, despite all my talking points that I've written down for myself, I neglected to mention that we're having a webinar on our toolkit next Wednesday. And if you go to our website, you'll find all the information on that. So I wanted to at least get that out there. So that's one opportunity to get more information. We are, as I said, one of our big goals in the Roots Initiative is engagement with our stakeholders, with our rural customers. So please reach out to us. We are happy to talk to anyone, anytime. We're happy to set up, virtual meetings or in-person meetings or whatever to discuss products, to discuss ideas. Whatever it is, we are very interested in talking to you about it. As I did mention, we're developing these 10 very community-focused workshops. If we're doing one in your area, we're certainly happy to, sort of go through the list of stakeholders and see if, who it makes sense to invite with you. So I guess what I would say is simply, please do feel free to reach out to us.
Great. Well, thank you so much for Rob, and thank you to all our panelists for joining us today. It was such a pleasure to hear your perspectives and share all these great resources as we begin to take advantage of our EV moment, as the EC likes to say over and over again. We're glad you've joined us. We want to be a partner with all of you, so feel free to reach out at any time if you need connections. We will be sharing a resources presentation from this webinar, and happy to make introductions and share resources so that we can maximize the benefits. So thank you all again today, and please reach out. Have a great day.